meeting is being recorded.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining today. I'm joining you from Spokane, Washington, where it's 6:30 a.m. So I've got my large cup of coffee, though, so I'm well prepared and looking forward to today. You know, as we build momentum through our process, the whole idea of this feasibility study, what is that, and how do we make use of something like that, is an important week for us as we think about the steps forward, the information to be gathered, systematically collected and analyzed, and then having that drive strategy. And we've got two great strategists with us today from Vantage Point, excellent consulting firm. You know, we give you lots of opportunity to hear from experts in these programs, and we think that we pick some great folks to share their knowledge with us. And so Kevin Clone and Christy Sabo from Vantage Point have been working with communities and broadband providers for a good number of years in Illinois and the Midwest and elsewhere to help them come to agreement about how to do these partnerships. And so I'm just going to turn it over to Kevin, who I think will lead off and set the stage for us. So welcome, Kevin.
Sure. Thanks, Bill. And thanks, Adrian. Benton Institute. It looks like you got another great cohort. I've got a whole bunch of names and faces on my screen. But I just want to do a little short thumbnail of who Vantage Point is. You know, as Bill said, we've done a lot of work in Illinois, but the elevator pitch on Vantage Point is we're an engineering and consulting firm. We're based out of Mitchell, South Dakota. That's where Christy's at. I work out of my home office in Milwaukee. That's in Wisconsin, because you can tell from these two things up here. So hope that doesn't put me in the hole right off the bat. But the elevator pitch, like I said, on Vantage Point, we're an engineering consulting firm that really focuses on rural broadband. I mean, everybody that's on this call is obviously aware of the Connect Illinois program. In Illinois specifically, boy, you have to help me, Christy. I think we did 9 applications the first round. We were 9 out of 10 with our clients the first round and 4 out of 4 for the second round. So we've done a lot of work in Illinois on grant programs, a lot of work nationally on grant programs. Our clients have received over $2.5 billion of funding in various programs. We've been, you know, of late, obviously, there seems like there's money flowing from everywhere, not just BEAD, which everybody knows about, but Connect Illinois and many other state grant programs. But the theme or topic this week is feasibility studies. And like I said, we do engineering. We've got almost 500 employees, and probably 400 of them are some flavor of engineer. But the other side of our house, our consulting side, and where the feasibility studies are done. And then Christy leads that group. But every one of these funding programs have some sort of a feasibility. I hesitate to say feasibility study. Feasibility study takes on a lot of different definitions. Some people want to look at a feasibility study from the perspective of a market study. You know, maybe it's a stakeholder outreach, stakeholder meetings. Where Christie's side comes in from the purely financial feasibility study side, as any kind of a funding program will have a financial feasibility component to it. Very broadly, and Christy will dive into this in some of her presentation here, there's kind of the hard scoring kind of part of it, if you will. That's the financial part where, is this going to make sense financially? Is it going to pay back the loan, or possibly, you know, there's going to be some kind of a match that goes in. And then there's the soft part of it, which is all the outreach, the stakeholder meetings, the meeting with community anchor institutions and community groups and public sector sides, that maybe there's a private sector side that's doing a grant submission, or if it's a public sector side, have you engaged all of the stakeholders along the way? So feasibility study, like I said, takes on a lot of different definitions, but like I said, every grant submission, every funding submission flows through Christy's office. She's the director of our consulting group. Like I said, she's in Mitchell, South Dakota. I failed to mention that we do have an office in Springfield, on the west side of Springfield, Illinois, Vantage Point brick and mortar office. Kind of as we go through the presentation today, Christy and I have done this presentation in a number of different formats for various cohorts within Connect, the Accelerate Illinois program. We've also worked with Bill in other states as well. frankly, I'm kind of the sales guy. Christy's the director of our consulting group. She'll give you all the stuff you need to know. And then if we're broadcasting a football game, I'm kind of like the color commentator. I'm the guy. I saw Adrian smile there. Yeah, you'll see shortly. I'm kind of known for my candid talk. I'll put Christy on the spot a few times through the course of this. I try to ask questions that I think if I were in the cohort seats, questions that I would want to know about if I were sitting there saying, hey, what do I do next? So I'll provide some color along the way. Christy, I'll kind of let you do your own introduction for your team and your group, and then I'll let you blast off.
All right, thanks, Kevin. And yes, thank you guys for letting us join you this morning. As Kevin said, I am the Director of Consulting. I've been with Vantage Point since 2006. We are having our 20-year anniversary this month. Prior to Vantage Point, I was in banking for several years. So I'm not going to give you my age, but I've been around the street here for a while. As Kevin said, I lead a lot of our feasibility work, a lot of our grant funding applications, loan applications, working with entities similar as yourself that are navigating what does it mean to be a broadband provider or bringing a broadband provider. We also do a lot of partnerships. So whether you as a community don't want to be a service provider of sorts, what does it look like to outreach to an existing service provider to come into your community and partner with? So we do a lot of that as well. I like to be really interactive. I know it's early, it's 8:30. If you have questions, as Kevin says, he does a great job moderating. I always kind of laugh when he gives the introduction that he's the sales guy. Kevin is very knowledgeable, very sharp, so he brings a lot of flair to the presentation. But by all means, use the chat function, or if I can see you, or Bill, Adrian, or Nancy, if you can see hands going up. We want this to be as beneficial to you as we can, and not just listening to me talk for the next 45 minutes. So with that, I am going to share my screen. Are you guys able to see my opening slide? Okay, I see a thumbs up. So yes, this week we are focusing on the feasibility study. As Kevin said, we've got our contact information here. So afterwards, we can get this presentation slides out to Bill, Nancy, and Adrian, and they can get it out to you. But if you've got questions, we love to interact with people to help. I mean, our goal is to get broadband to everyone. So our contact information is here. Feel free to reach out to us if you've got questions. So jumping into the feasibility study, some of the first questions that we ask is why? Why should you complete a feasibility study? And ultimately, these 4 bullets here that we have are the main components of it. Is really when you're looking at your communities, how you want to grow it. It's the ultimate strategic approach to what that operation may be. Again, is it a matter of you as the community being a brand new broadband provider? Is it a fact that your community has a gap? And strategically, you are wanting to see economic development growth in your community. So in order to do that, solid broadband network connectivity is required. So walking through ultimately what that strategic approach to your operations will be. Capitalizing on opportunities. It's scary when you look back, but 2.5 years into, the COVID pandemic, when it hit, unfortunately, a lot of communities that did not have a solid broadband network really were hurt when the COVID pandemic hit, because everybody were at home, tried to maintain school life from a remote setting. People were outplaced, back to go home to work. And if you didn't have that solid broadband component at your home for a connectivity piece, it really was a hindrance. And so with that, we've seen states, we've seen the federal government, we've seen communities, all of these entities and government bodies showing that, okay, this was a huge impact. We need to get funding out there. So we're meeting the community demands, we're meeting the community needs, and we've got all of these funding programs that are coming down the pipe to get a broadband connectivity coverage to all. So really, when you're looking at the feasibility study, it puts you in a position where you are able to capitalize on what these opportunities are coming down the pipe. Also, if you're looking at bringing not only broadband, but you're also wanting to be a new voice provider and or video, that's a real big tricky piece as far as what the demographics of your community are and whether you need to have something from a new video offering perspective. But ultimately, what does it take to deploy those services? What is the revenue opportunity? What are the operating costs? So really the feasibility study will give you that clear picture of what this looks like from a financial perspective, what the investment would be, and overall what that profitability may be from a provider perspective. And as Kevin stated in his intro, it is a requirement. So if you're wanting to secure funding for your community, whether it be grant funding, loans, or if you're issuing bonds, really it's a component where you need to know what it's going to take to operate, build, and deploy services, what that funding requirement may be if you don't have an overabundance of cash sitting around to fund this investment. So with that, next slide is once we figure out, yes, we're strategic, we need to do a feasibility study. Ultimately, the feasibility study is going to help us define the problem. You as a community leaders need to also be involved in those conversations and identify what it is we want to solve. Are we a community where we have limited availability? Do we have only a handful of providers, and those providers that we do have in our area is not making the investment? They've got poor service. It's spotty at best. Are they affordable services? Is the service offerings that they do have, is it making a point where some families may not be able to afford it because they're charging you over $100 or $150, but you've got very inferior service? Unreliable. Is it out when the wind blows the right way? Is it out when everybody is home in the evenings from work and school, and you've got teenagers that are doing their gaming, but you've got mom and dad who are trying to get caught up on work? So really it's taking a look at what it is that's the issue in your community, trying to figure out what that problem is and what the main problem is that you want to solve. When we look at the different problems that may be there, depending on what those problems are, can increase or decrease the overall viability of the project and potentially the payback term. One thing that we have seen, not necessarily, I guess, with the community, but when you look at, some providers or some entities that come in, if they're a cooperative, they've got the values and their mission statement is we provide service to all. So if our service area covers the entire community and rural, we have to build a network that's going to cover it, but it may not be viable from a financial perspective. But because they're trying to solve the problem of getting service to all, whether you've got coverage or not, really trying to take into perspective of what it is you want to solve and making sure you run that analysis, that you're doing that in a way that is feasible. I mean, that's what the feasibility study is going to do from a financial perspective. The one thing too we look at is, being realistic with that return on investment, both from a timeline and what that return on investment, that return you're wanting to see. We are looking at, especially if we're looking at a fiber to the home build, that is not a cheap investment. Fiber to the home is costly, and with COVID and all of these funding programs that are coming up, we are seeing a huge hit on our basic economics 101, supply and demand. We've got a huge demand for getting fiber, getting broadband networks built, and it's hard to maintain that supply. So we are seeing a huge increase in cost of what that fiber network is going to be. So when you're looking at a 30-year life asset at a inflated cost because of our supply chain issues that we are seeing, to be anticipating and expecting a positive return on that investment by year 4, year 5 is really an unrealistic expectation that you're walking into this with. Taking that into account, what your investment cost is, what your return as far as a end user revenue perspective, what your take rate is going to be. So as you're looking at the market, how many of those end users are going to be taking your service? That's going to impact the revenue flows coming in to help support the cost of that network that you're going to be building. And again, that last bullet there, doing a complete build of a community. Yes, you're going to provide coverage to all, but it will have a longer payback because you're going to have a higher upfront investment cost.
Hey, Christy, I'll throw a question at you quick and I'll let you take a drink along the way. With the timeline part, we all know that there's supply chain challenges, and we can take a deep dive on that because that's very impactful.
Correct.
But can you speak to the build out requirements of different funding programs? Because I know they're different with different programs.
So yeah, each program is different. And one thing that we are seeing is we talk, the Broadband Equity Access Program, so BEAD. We're hearing the Reconnect, the Community Connect, the State Connect Illinois program. Each program is going to have defined build out timelines. So Connect Illinois, the prior rounds, we're looking at how they're going to incorporate that with the BEAD money. But BEAD, you've got a 4-year build out time frame. So you have to get your project area built within a 5-year, otherwise you risk potentially being non-compliant with your timeline. So taking a look at that, and if you're going after funding, it's very important to know what that timeline is. Some of these programs will potentially allow a waiver to extend it a year if you're able to show supporting documentation that you've been trying and you just can't get the materials, you can't get contractors on site to build it in the time fashion that you want.
So Christy, I'll be on this one. So Community Connect, I think, is 2 years. Is that correct? So, and let me back up a step for the benefit of the audience. Just to give you an idea of the Vantage Point client base in Illinois, we work with a lot of telephone companies. Now, when I say telephone companies, I don't mean Verizon and AT&T. I'm talking about independent, smaller phone companies. Some are commercial companies. Most of them are cooperative, not-for-profit companies. We also work with municipal utilities and electric cooperatives. Although in Illinois, there's only a couple electric cooperatives that are doing broadband. But the reason I told you all of that, Joe Carroll Energy, a client of ours up in northwestern Illinois, they're up near Galena. They're in Joe Davies, Carroll, and White counties. They got a Community Connect grant. I think that was 2 years, right? So so just to give you an idea of this feasibility piece and the point about the timeline, Joe Carroll has a Community Connect grant as 2 years. They've got Connect Illinois, which is 3, and they got a Reconnect award, which is 5. Well, these projects have to coordinate amongst themselves as well. So as you're considering either as a community level going after some sort of funding and working on a feasibility study, or maybe you're working with a private provider or non-profit cooperative of some sort, you're going to have to work with them, or you're within your leadership group, to determine these different timelines for build out. So I don't mean to waylay too much Christy's presentation here, but it is because of the supply chain challenges we're having, the timeline consideration is critical, and that dramatically can impact your feasibility study. Because as she said, all of these programs have a financial feasibility part to it, part to the submissions, where it may not look very pretty for the first 2 years or 3 years, where you're going to have to show that over the course of time. And also, I should tell you, we primarily, although we do a fair bit of wireless engineering, the vast majority, I'd say 90% of the business we do is on rural fiber to the home builds, rural, and I wouldn't say urban in the sense of Chicago, but suburban and rural fiber to the home builds. So Christy, I'm sorry I interrupted, but that piece is critical on the timeline.
Yep. Thank you, Kevin. So I see a couple of questions, and thank you, Adrian, for responding on the BEAD. One thing our industry loves is acronyms. So I apologize if I say an acronym and you don't know what it is, throw it out there. I will try to be cautious of that. But yes.
Christy?
Yes.
Hi, this is Bill. I just wanted to point out that in a few weeks, we'll be have one day strictly on the federal state funding programs.
Okay.
Then the next week, the local funding authority. So
Perfect.
We'll get all into those acronyms.
Perfect. Thank you. So recapping this slide, the defining the problem is, what is the problem? How do you want to fix the problem? And why do you want to fix the problem? And this all comes into play when we're building the feasibility. So this chart here, I really like. It's a nice flow chart of what the different steps are to ensure success if you're going to be looking at deploying broadband or bringing broadband to your community. We are not going to hit all of these steps, but I like to share this just so you get the sense that doing broadband is not a overnight decision that you randomly make and say, yep, let's do broadband, let's run for it. You need to do your due diligence. You need to go through the process. You need to go through the step to make sure it makes sense. What we're focusing on today is really this section here, the business plan, the feasibility study, running your analysis, and then dumping it all into your financial study. So I'll give you this slide to kind of get the feel, but again, we're going to focus only a small portion of this due to the time we have. Unless you guys want to sit around all day and talk, we could do that too, because I like to talk. With this, the first analysis that we need to do is really start running that preliminary market analysis. At this point, we are not doing a full-fledged study where you are canvassing the communities, you're talking to people. It's really doing your demographic view. It's the key questions that you need to answer. What is the current size of the area that we're wanting to hit, that you're wanting to have overbuilt? What are the demographics? And demographics are really key based on what you have for a population base that is living in your communities to drive what type of demand and services there may be. A middle age, younger age demographic. I like to consider myself still kind of in that, but age-wise, I may be a little bit on the higher side. Do you have new families that are coming with kids? They want to work from home. They are moving out from, urban Chicago area, maybe wanting to get more rural area, but they want to have the ability to work from home. You've got kids, whether that's teenagers or younger kids, they're drawing demand on streaming videos, they're doing the gaming, or do you have an older demographic where they're not doing the gaming, they maybe are scrolling on the internet, looking at vacations, doing the ancestry.com, sending pictures and videos of their grandkids, they're FaceTiming, doing that type of thing. What's their demand? What's they're going to hit? What's the growth potential of your communities? Are you seeing, like I said, people from the urban areas moving out of the cities wanting to get more rural area, or are you seeing a decline because you don't have a solid broadband offering? They're out migrating just because they don't have the resources in their home in order to have the lifestyle that they want. What type of regulatory requirements? And this one is kind of an iffy one. I mean, depending on where you're at. Is there a state or a community or city that has some type of regulatory requirements and what that may look like as far as service offerings that you want to do? And then the political landscape and the community support. Obviously all of you are joining this morning. You're part of this Accelerate Illinois. So hopefully you're supporting the community. You're looking at how you can better improve the economics of your communities, and broadband is a solid component for that.
Christy, can you talk a little bit about the business community analysis and maybe anchor institutions?
Yes. So anchor institutions, we hear a lot about community anchor institutions as we're looking at these funding programs. And what is a community anchor institution? So when you look at that, is what type of school, educational type components? Do you have early childhood centers? I know in the Midwest, our area, MB is a big one that's focused on children and women. Do you have public safety? Do you have volunteer fire departments? Do you have emergency systems, any healthcare, long-term living, assisted living, memory care facilities? Anything that really can have a strong demand and need for a solid broadband connection to be able to do that. From a business perspective, Bill, I'm if you're looking at the communities, those from a need and a revenue perspective, your businesses, depending on the size, may generate a higher average revenue per user, per entity. They're going to be looking at more dedicated pipes coming into their business from a solid connectivity perspective. And is that kind of what you were looking at, Bill?
Yeah. Hey, Christy, I'll jump in and do the color commentator thing. The question that came in was, does the feasibility study include business needs? And I'll say yes, absolutely, from two perspectives. Two large perspectives. Number one is on the early case kind of market analysis. of what are your businesses. And generally, you're not talking about Caterpillar, although in Peoria, it says, I see it says Steve from Peoria. You maybe talk about Caterpillar, but I would guess they're probably very well served. But the small and medium-sized businesses, they may only have a 25 meg DSL connection. So there's certainly going to be some market assessment as far as what the businesses have. And then the second big part of that is within the financial feasibility study side, your businesses are going to pay more for the circuits. They're going to pay for a guaranteed circuit. They may have backup data needs, et cetera. So there is a business component to the financial feasibility side. And then Adrian had a comment there, libraries are anchors too. Yes, absolutely.
Yep. Very good.
I hope I answered that question. If not, Steve, just chime in or contact me offline.
Okay. So then when we take a look at the competitive landscape, this is very, very important, especially as we're looking at the funding coming down the pipe, and that is in the pipe right now as far as what areas may be deemed eligible for these funding programs. So doing a competitive landscape analysis is very important. So you're taking a look at who the providers are that are currently serving your area or are claiming that they are serving their area. The incumbent providers, most communities have what is deemed as an incumbent provider. You either have an independent telephone company, like Kevin mentioned, whether it's a incumbent cooperative or a privately held. You may have Frontier, AT&T, CenturyLink, Intelliquent. They are all having a different view as far as how they're serving your area. We've got some entities and some providers that are very committed. They're investing in their network. They're maintaining, they're delivering a quality service. You've got others that are pinpointing, what is in their strategic mind of where they want to invest in their networks. And some networks, unfortunately, get ignored and not upgraded. So taking a look at that and how that incumbent provider may react if you are looking at bringing a new fiber deployment into your community. Some providers are not going to just sit there and let you overbuild them. Others may be aggressive. So doing your research on who they are and how they may respond. The next one, I've got a few acronyms in here. So CAF2 is the Connect America Fund reverse auction. It was phase 2. The RDOF is the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. That also was a reverse auction. These were auctions that the FCC held back in 2018 and 2020, where entities could participate in the auction and get monthly funding support for 10 years with an obligation that they have to meet deployment build-out requirements. So for CAF2 and RDOF, those winning entities have a 6-year time frame to get broadband at the speeds that they won these funding support. So taking a look at who those winners were, what their timeline build out is to get broadband to the areas that they were successful. The Reconnect funding, that's our USDA Reconnect. That is a 5-year build out requirement for grant funding primarily. There's some loan funding that goes along with that. State grant funding, taking a look at any of the Connect Illinois. I know that has been a little challenge. As Kevin said, we assisted several clients with securing funding. State of Illinois has some components to their grant that has been making it a little bit of a challenge as far as prevailing wage, minority entities trying to get the unionized components in with the state has been a little bit of a challenge. So those dollars have been slow rolling out the door. But how these entities that have secured these funding, how they're going to change maybe the dynamic of the landscape. Taking a look at what the current speeds and what technology deployments are out there. So again, if you've got a community where there is a solid fiber connection there, it may not make sense to duplicate that. Again, depending on who that provider is and how they're providing the service.
Christy, I'm going to jump in on you a little bit quick. I think there may be some comments or some thoughts amongst the audience. First off, you were very kind when you said some competitors may be pinpointing their areas, because I think the rest of the world calls that cherry picking or digital redlining, which I'm sure everybody that's on this call is frustrated with how that's occurring amongst the incumbent providers. And the incumbent providers, every area essentially, painting with a very broad brush, in Illinois has an incumbent provider of some sort. Uh, Generally speaking, again, in Illinois, there's some names you're familiar with, like AT&T and Frontier and CenturyLink, now Lumen or Brightspeed, depending on where you fall. So that's one thing. On the CAF2 and RDOF and Reconnect funding, specifically in Illinois with CAF2 and very, very specific with RDOF, within the Connect Illinois program right now, Illinois is one of the states that even if you do have an RDOF winner, and maybe I'll withhold the names to protect the guilty, but there are some winners in RDOF that there's a very strong suspicion they won't be able to deploy what they said they'll be able to deploy. So the broadband office in Illinois has said that RDOF winners, so let's say Kevin's Broadband, for example. Kevin's Broadband was a winner in some respective county. We all know Kevin's Broadband isn't any good, so we're gonna allow Connect Illinois funds to go into Kevin's area that he won, even though he was an RDOF winner. So, and again, with a broad brush, the vast majority of Illinois in RDOF was won at the 100 by 20 meg area. There were very, very few winners in Illinois that won at the fiber gigabit level. We had a few clients that did, but most of our clients that were bidding in RDOF did not win because they lost out to generally a wireless company that's bidding at 100 by 20. Happy to have those discussions offline with your respective areas, but that's, again, with the broad brush, that's what happened in Illinois. And then Chris, you were talking about the Connect Illinois kind of slow rolling. There's been some challenges because it was a new program in Illinois. There's still a lot of work being done. I'm sure Bill can adjust this in other sessions between what the Connect Illinois program is set up to do and what the BEAD rules are. And some of the challenges, I'll give you an example. Christy mentioned prevailing wage. There were some areas, in fact, there were a lot of areas where one of two things happened. Either there wasn't a job code set up for that specific county for that job function. And then secondly, if there was a job function that was close, it wasn't in line with what the real job was. For example, I'll give you an example. There was one area where a traditional fiber splicer, somebody who's working on the ground splicing fibers, well, the only job code for that area was an electrician, communications electrician, which was about double the standard labor rate for. So those have created some challenges to try to sort that out, and I know the broadband office is working on that, but it dramatically affected some of those financial feasibility studies. So there's, like the other one was the minority procurement piece, where a lot of the state certified minority firms that provided air quote communications equipment either wasn't really communication equipment or they didn't serve a particular area. Most of those candidly were in the Chicago area. So areas that were downstate, we reached out to several of them where they said, well, we don't really go that far. We don't go to Marion, Illinois, for example. We kind of work in Chicago or the collar counties. So those are some of the issues that are still being sorted out on the Connect Illinois program.
Thanks, Kevin. The last bullets I have on here is, when you're looking at the competitive landscape, are what's being reported accurate? Up till now, providers who are doing broadband voice had to file semi-annually data as of June 30th and December 31st, a form which is known as the FCC Form 477. Which historically it had been okay, but now that we are getting very competitive and we have all these funding programs, the 477 is not working. What they typically have done is you would report on a census block level, and if you had one location within that census block, you reported that whole block as being served. So you could have a census block that had 150 locations. If you served just one, that whole area would be deemed served when in fact it really isn't. So the FCC has known that this has been a flawed process. It's been discussed and hashed. And so what we're at now is this last bullet is the broadband data collection. Another acronym, you hear BDC. This is what is being referred to as the ultimate broadband fabric. So we are right now in the throes of doing the broadband data collection for several clients. All entities should be in the process of getting this done. Filing is due September 1st. It's reflective of June 30th data. So this is what the FCC is hoping is going to give us the overall blanket fabric of where coverage is and where coverage is not, also based on technology. The map I have here is kind of a snapshot from what the FCC has been using based on the 477. So the darker the blue, the more providers that are providing service. So it's a very flawed system when you dig into it, but that's what we've got now, and hopefully this fabric will solve that. But I anticipate that we are not going to have a clean fabric as of September 2nd. It's going to be challenged and challenged and challenged. So digging into the next step, market study, this is where you are actually getting that statistical analysis done. You're sending out surveys. You're surveying the people that are living in the areas, whether it's the businesses or if you're focusing on just residential areas. It can be done a variety of ways. Typically, you engage a marketing firm, a third-party entity that will actually do this, that are seasoned and experienced in it. It can take the form of a mail survey, a telephone survey, online, a hybrid, which is a mix. We've also seen, demand aggregation, where you put like a crowdsourcing on a website. People could go in and hit that as far as what they're getting. Also done in the form of a focus group. I personally, if my phone rings, which I don't have a landline anymore, I'm one of the cord cutters from a landline perspective, but it's hard. We're all busy, so it's hard to get that telephone survey. But these entities that do this have the right tricks. They can get people to take the 10 minutes to be on the call and get those surveys. But really what it's going to do is validate what a take rate is going to be based on the results of the questions that they ask. They try to hit where you're going to canvas a sampling size of the community to where you can hit a margin of error of plus or minus 5, meaning of the sample size that you take, 95% of that is going to be the response that the entire body will take. So that's where the statistical piece comes in. The investment to do a market study, depending on what that sample size of completed surveys that they would need to get in order to hit that margin of error. We have seen market studies come in, oh gosh, anywhere from 15,000 upwards of 35,000. It really depends on how many surveys that they need to get. But we do recommend, maybe not at the beginning of it, but once you've run that analysis as far as the demographics and the competitive landscape, you've run your CapEx, you've got the financial, and if the financial feasibility study is saying that you need a 65% or a 70% take rate, you'll probably want to have this market study done to make sure that you will in fact be able to achieve that high of a take rate. So the financial feasibility study itself really is the financial driver of what this is going to look like. The key components of it is a solid balance sheet, statement of operations where we're generating all of our income sources. So if we're doing broadband, if we're getting some large enterprise business revenues, if we're getting dedicated circuits, if you're building a fiber network that's going to be big enough and you can lease some of that fiber as a dark fiber lease, that's another revenue stream. All of the operating expenses, making sure, taking into consideration not only the cost of service that are variable expenses. So if you're doing broadband, counting for the bandwidth, the transport, your after hours support, those call center type costs, those are going to fluctuate based on what you have from a take rate, but also making sure you're accounting for those fixed costs, the maintenance on the equipment, your personnel, your staffing, general and administrative. It's going to be a new accounting dynamic. If you've got grant funding, what's the regulatory compliance, the ongoing reporting compliance, marketing, sales, all of those components that you're going to have regardless if you've got a 40% take rate or an 80% take rate. That all is going to go into detailed spreadsheets that will flow into your operation statement, your income statement.
Christy, on that one, you mentioned a couple of terms there. We talked about bandwidth and call center and transport. We don't need to dive into each of those respectively, but whether anybody in this call chooses to work with a consulting firm like Vantage Point or any other, those are some of the questions they're going to be going through with you on the operational cost side, where there's all of this. I mean, I think a lot of people are so focused on, I just need to serve the Jones house with gigabit broadband. I want to get the plan. And amen, brother, I believe you. Let's serve people, but there's also a lot of this back office stuff that really needs to be thought about. And like I said, us or any other consultant can walk through that with you, but there's a lot of the back office piece. And then secondly, and maybe Chris, you're going to talk about this later, but if for example, you even though earlier I said Kevin's broadband really stinks, well, now Kevin's broadband is really good, and you want to partner with Kevin's broadband because he's a county over and you want him to come to your county, some of the operational stuff that you may have to put into your feasibility study, I'll most certainly have that in place to run my own business. I may need to add 10, 20, 50% more to serve your county. But those operational sides, that's a big, deep dive that Christy's gone over in 30 seconds.
Yeah, and highly recommend, if you are engaging, to have a financial feasibility study, that whoever you're working with to have that done, that they walk through what their assumptions were. When Vantage Point does a financial feasibility study, the spreadsheet, we don't hand over an Excel spreadsheet, but the sheet, the data that we give you goes through and basically identify. So when you're reviewing it, you can see what the drivers were for all of our expense components. We break them out line by line. So you can see that we've accounted for staff. How many personnel are we doing? Are we covering benefits? The regulatory, the filing compliance, all of those are broken out, and then it's all rolled up into the income statement. The general fund summary. So here's where we break out what our investment is going to be. So what are we needing for CapEx, fiber, electronics, the drops, is there cabinets, offices, buildings that we're going to need, vehicles, that all flows through. So you can see year by year what your investment is going to be, what it's going to take from an outflow of funding, whether it's cash or grants or loans. Cash flow summary, your projected return on your investment, return on your equity. And then it's really important too, depending on what you're going to be doing from a financing or a funding perspective, is identifying and calculating out what those financial ratios are. A lot of boards like to see this, whether it's your equity, your EBITDA, if you're getting loan, what's your times interest earned ratio, your debt service coverage ratio, and there's a variety of those different components, but identifying what those metrics are. We like to do a 10-year financial feasibility view. If you do a 5-year, you may get turned off right away, because like I said, we're doing a 5-year business plan with a 20-year, 30-year asset. You're probably not going to see positive margins by the end of that 5th year. We typically like to see positive margins coming in after year 5, 6, 7, 8. So if you look at a 10-year view, it gives you a better view. But again, there's some crystal balling that goes in there, because it's hard to predict what's going to happen 10 years down the road, as you all probably know.
Christy?
Yes.
I just want to point out that a lot of folks on this call probably won't be creating their own utilities. But what this feasibility study does then is really gives you an idea of how much subsidy that you may have to bring to the table, either through your own dollars or federal or state dollars, to make this an attractive business investment for a provider partner.
Correct. And, with COVID, I'm assuming a lot of you have seen the ARPA funding. So the CARES dollars that have come out, and, the component that was for broadband, and hopefully if you still have those dollars out, or if you have already given out dollars for broadband that you may have received, you would have hopefully required them or ensured that they would have done some sort of feasibility, so you knew your dollars were going to a viable project. So I know we're coming up here on 9:15, but I wanted to kind of hit some of these next steps. Obviously, it may seem pretty simple to run a business plan if you've got the accounting financial background, but really make sure that you're enlisting the proper assistance to really get the data inputs put into there the way it should. The big one is the capital expenditure investments, and that comes in play with the engineering requirements, especially from a funding perspective. If you've got an obligation, if you're getting grant funding and they require 100 meg down, 100 megabit upload, dynamic, whether it's a symmetrical, if you've got a requirement to offer a gig with those funding dollars, that you're designing and engineering a network that will be able to support what the obligations are, because you're going to have to report and prove that you actually did build what you said you were going to do with those funding. The timeline, we've talked about that. Does the funding have a set requirement where you have to have it built by a certain timeline? Or if you're not going after funding, do you have the ability to look at, we're doing in a phased in approach? Yes, we would like to get 100% coverage across the entire community, but do we not necessarily, Kevin's word, cherry pick, or my word, pinpoint, but you phase in and hit those areas that have the higher return. So hit your business corridors, hit those larger revenue service entities first, then branch out into the residential. Is an accelerated build? Is it something that you, again, hitting these areas and going faster to get it built, so then you can get the return starting to hit at the end? The pilot area, this is good in theory, but I do caution, especially if you are an unserved community where you may only hit a pilot area, because word spreads. And if you're only hitting a certain little quadrant and maybe that works or it doesn't work, making sure that you're prepared for what the others who are not involved in that pilot area may perceive that the build hitting it out. And then, the next step, we kind of talked about this, is we run the feasibility. And if we're showing what a 75% or a 60% take rate is required to make the plan work, that market study will hopefully validate whether or not that can be achieved. And with the feasibility study, keep that fresh. You build it up front, and then sometimes what we see is then it gets put on the shelf behind you and you forget about it. The feasibility study is meant to be kind of a living, breathing document. So as you're building, as it's getting done, refresh, see what needs to change, what your inputs need to do. If you're seeing a higher return or a lower return, higher expense, are there better efficiencies that maybe can be achieved? And then these are just, some overall keys that we like to share as far as what makes a successful deployment. Good planning, doing it right the first time, really doing your market analysis as far as you don't want to go into a community the size of 25,000 and build out a 4-fiber network. That you're going to be running into problems 2 or 3 blocks in. Making sure that you're engaging the right people to build it, to be future proof, to anticipate long-term growth, making sure that you're getting the right training of staff who's going to be in implementing it, running it, selling it, whether that's at the executive level, marketing, sales, customer service, hitting your maximum revenues and being disciplined from a financial perspective. Build strategically to the lower cost, higher margin areas first, turn up customers as quickly as possible, and then continue to look for those higher average revenue per user service offerings. Dedicated services, transport. Do you have wireless towers where you could potentially get some of that fiber connection to that tower, which is a pretty good revenue stream coming in from that perspective as well. Minimizing expenses, trying to be as efficient as you can from both CapEx, OpEx. Again, doing it right the first time, look for efficiencies when or where possible. And then really the last one we have seen over and over again, if you have staff that are experienced, have the right training, the background, and are good with customer service, those good people skills, you'll have the best broadband network, you'll have the best customer support, and that really gives the overall good experience for your community members. It's, again, do the due diligence, do it right, get the right people there, and it'll be successful.
First, we had a question come in that says, how much will a feasibility study cost for a small town interested in broadband and having a utility service? So I responded and said an answer verbally. If I were to meet someone at an industry conference somewhere and we're having a cup of coffee, or as Bill knows, a cup of coffee and a ham sandwich can solve a lot of these broadband problems. I've said that a lot. I would tell you probably 25,000 that can range. It depends on how deep you want to go. And this, you said small town in this question, it's probably more like the 15 to 25 range. But some of that, it really depends on, like, Christy said the marketing study, and she mentioned third parties. Although Vantage Point can do the market study, we prefer not to do it. We've got lots of industry partners we work with, and we can give you 3, 4, 5 different places to call. And the reason for that is we don't want to do a marketing study and say, oh yeah, your community wants broadband, and oh, by the way, we want to do the feasibility study and we want to do the engineering and help you build it. We want to have a third party be engaged there. And like I said, we've got lots of references, but my answer to that question generally would be 25,000, but the range being 25 to, or excuse me, 15 to 30, 35. We've got competitors. I just saw one in Michigan. They're going to do a study for 225,000, and we would easily do it for 224. I would argue that's insane overkill. You can get to a Connect Illinois or a Reconnect submission from a funding side, you can get a whole heck of a lot done for 25,000 to be ready to go.
Yeah.
So that's the sales guy and color commentators answer. Christy, if you have anything you want to add to that from.
No, I think you're close. Really where the variable is how large of a community you're wanting to serve and what that looks like as far as determining the CapEx, because our engineering team are going to look at the maps to see where the best routes would be to plant that fiber. They do, anywhere from a 10 to 20,000 foot view at this feasibility stage to give you what that CapEx, but they come pretty darn close in their estimates on what they see based on, we've been doing this for 20 years plus. We've got engineers that have been in the industry for a lot longer than that. So
yeah, I'll add to that too, Christy, when you said about the CapEx development side, you as a community or provider, you don't want to do any necessarily engineering. You don't want to design your network, right? You want to do enough engineering or enough high level design that you're very comfortable in with the CapEx number. So let's say it's $17.4 million, right? Making that number up. You don't want to go and do a bunch of engineering to find out, oh, it's really 17 million exactly, or it's 18.1, right? Because you're going to spend a ton of money on the engineering design, because at the end of the day, this is for a grant submission that is a giant lottery ticket, right? So no, I would argue that lottery ticket, we're very fortunate with our clients to be successful with those lottery tickets. But yeah, you want to do enough engineering where you're comfortable, but we'll caution you on this. Some people will just say, well, we'll just pad that a little. We'll pad this and we'll pad that, and we'll kind of add some fluff money in there. Well, almost every one of these programs has a matching component to it. So if it's 17.4 million and you go in and say, well, we're going to call it 20, but you still have to provide 25% of that, you're going to put $5 million in when you really probably only had to put in whatever the math works out to 14 or 4.4 million or whatever. So keep that in mind to do just enough engineering on the feasibility study side where you're comfortable with the number, but not overkill. Mm-hmm. But like I said, that's kind of where the wild card is on how much engineering you want to have done.
Correct.
That's a long answer to the question. Bill, looks like you had something to say there, a question?
Yeah, there's and then there's a question in the chat too that we can get to, but I always think about these feasibility studies, if you can, as Kevin would say, have your cup of coffee and a ham sandwich with a provider who's in the next county over, they might absorb a lot of these costs for the feasibility study, that they'll either have a firm like your own or have some internal capabilities to generate those numbers. And so your need for if you have a provider partner, your need for a feasibility study is much less. Can you talk a little bit about the use of a feasibility study to attract provider partners?
Let me take that first part first, quick. We talked about attracting a private provider side. Again, we're skewed. We work with about 30 providers in Illinois, like I said, across kind of the gambit, but they're all generally smaller community-based providers. I shouldn't even say small. They're smaller than the big guys, but they're covering a lot of area. I would suggest, if I were the county executive in Kevin County and you want better service in your area, I would suggest reaching out 1 or 2 counties over, take your circle on your map and extend it to say, who is in this outer donut around me that may possibly want to come into my area and reach out. And, Bill and I have joked for a long time about a cup of coffee and a ham sandwich, but I sincerely believe that where if you can get Mr. Jones and Mrs. Smith together to talk about how they might have mutual interests, you probably can come up with a solution. So reaching out to a private provider nearby on the feasibility study side, they will have a lot of those data points already. They already know, hey, I already did an extra city. I have a pretty good idea of what it's going to cost to do your area. So it's worth having that discussion. Now, and Christy, I'll let you answer as well, but Bill's question about if you do a feasibility study, will that attract somebody? Yes, certainly. I think it develops a lot of good data points to take to the other providers in your area. However, I would caution, and I've seen this in Illinois and in other areas, where people start building a map. Every time I hear somebody say they're going to build a map, I hear them talking about, in my eyes or my ears, I hear them saying, I'm going to develop another bad map. Even the best maps the new BDC map that should come out should be pretty decent. But if you kind of get in and say, here's exactly, 123 Maple Avenue has terrible service. I would argue that 123 Maple Avenue probably has decent service. They may have a bad router in their house, or it's the Wi-Fi hotspot they put in their houses in the basement. So there may be some connectivity things, but I think from a higher level, if a community or a county or a region were to go and say, we've done a study and we think this part of our town is underserved, you're probably right. And I would guess that those providers, either the incumbent providers or the neighboring providers that may be interested, the incumbent providers probably know that. That's Kevin's opinion. And the providers that may come into the area, they probably suspect that, hey, I think I can get to the northwest part of Smith County. And if you're the county executive of Smith County and you say, hey, Kevin's broadband, this area is kind of poorly served, that I already think that. Now you've confirmed it. Now let's take a deeper dive and do that feasibility study and take a look at, is it well served and what would it cost to build there? So again, that's a lot of Kevin's opinion. Christy, if you've got thoughts there.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you shared, kind of just piggybacking on the feasibility, depending on how the feasibility is getting structured. Is it a brand new entity who doesn't have efficiencies or operations already in place? It's going to probably look different than a existing incumbent provider who has staffing, has skills, so they would be able to more efficiently come in and operate and provide that network. So their overhead, so to speak, may not look so different. So they will want to run their own feasibility based on what they have for their actual costs. But it's a good tool to see if it even makes sense to start engaging in potential conversations, is kind of what I would just share.
There's a question about that there's multiple muni broadband entities, utilities. What's your experience in, have you seen many county-wide entities, a county taking on the entire county with a brand new build?
I guess I've seen a lot of city, local, municipal entities that are doing the electric, they're doing water, waste, and adding in broadband to a component. I've seen several of those. I guess at a county level, I don't know, Kevin, I haven't myself at the full county level.
Kind of go off the top of my head. I can't come up with anything. I'm sure there's something somewhere, right? But off the top of my head, I'm not aware of any counties that have said, hey, Smith County, we're going to do this and operate it on our own. Generally on the county level side, it tends to be more of a middle mile. Now, middle mile has two definitions as well. When a county says middle mile, they generally mean to those community anchor institutions, the schools and libraries and public safety and healthcare, to connect those anchors together. When a provider, whether they're a typical broadband provider clients or one of the big guys like an AT&T or other providers, when they hear middle mile, they mean St. Louis to Springfield to Bloomington to Chicago, middle mile, longer, transport route. But generally on the county side, I see more of that middle mile piece. And right now there's a number of counties that are doing studies, not just in Illinois, but nationally in preparation for BEAD, trying to see what it might cost. Counties can certainly do it. my personal opinion is the county should engage with a private provider of some sort to say, hey, Kevin's Broadband, you've been doing this for 50 years. Let's put some KPIs in place, and whether that's KPIs from the performance of the network from a technical perspective, but also from an affordability perspective, and also making sure that pinpointing or redlining or cherry picking doesn't happen, that we want every serviceable address in our county served. So, hey, Kevin's Broadband, if we can agree on that, and as long as you've got quality service and affordable service at some predetermined number, let's form some kind of public-private partnership and do that, as opposed to the county taking on and running it themselves.
Yeah.
That's my opinion.
And so I think the closest to that is out in Vermont, that they've got these now what they're calling utility districts, and those are actually multi-county entities. I think there's about 8 in the state.
There's 9 of them in Vermont. 2 of them, one of them we're doing the vast majority of the engineering for. 2 of them we're working with the private provider. One of them actually has engaged Google to be their provider. Community union districts, yeah. Locally, they call them CUDs, which is offensive to many up there, but community union districts. Like I said, we've got 2 that are the private. They've engaged private providers. In both cases, it was a local independent telephone company that came in to run it. Like I said, another one, Google came in to run. But there's kind of everything under the sun. Sorry, I'm looking at the questions too. What is the typical turnaround for time for a feasibility study? Christy, what's the latest on that?
So depending on the different components, so engineering, financial, competitive landscape, we are probably, I would say, a 3-month time frame.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And through this process, we're really, we're asking communities to go out there and do this survey. So we've got through Illinois Extension, doing some good community guidance on how to get a good sample and get a good return. That's in process. Community meetings and provider interviews and so on. So we've really got people thinking about these components of the feasibility study, that they'll be well prepared if they decide they need to do a more formal one, to say exactly what it is that they need to do to be successful with the feasibility study, to have it really be a funnel for decision making. That's what when I talk to people about feasibility studies, it's you're eliminating things you don't want to do, driving towards what it is that you do want to do through this process, not just passively receive a study. You want to use this as a decision-making tool.
Absolutely, yeah. We don't do feasibility. No, this is again about Vantage Point. We don't do feasibility studies to determine that the answer is yes, and you got to do it. I mean, it's meant to be a decision tool. Now, almost everybody that wants a feasibility study, the answer is to get to yes. So part of that discussion becomes, well, the answer can be yes, it's feasible, but it's going to take you 8 years before this thing pencils, or maybe it's 4, right? But I think most people use them as a tool to find out what's it going to take to get me to where I want to go, as opposed to, now there's private equity companies that are coming in, there's money flying in all over the place right now. They just want to get in. How fast can I get this making money for me in 36 months? And that's where that cherry picking and redlining comes in. Christy, there's 2 questions that are very similar.
Yep.
Did I understand this correctly, that a feasibility study is required for some of these grants? And then the follow-up is, would the Illinois Connect grant need a feasibility study included in the application?
Yes. So the answer is yes, yes, and yes. It depends on the program, on what level of feasibility study. So if we look at what's going to be required for the BEAD application, which we are a year plus away from when the states will be ready to release those, but it'll be a 5-year standalone feasibility study. Reconnect, which is with USDA, they look at a total consolidated feasibility study. So whoever the applicant, the applying entity is, provides 4 years of historical, and then do a kind of our bridge year, and then an additional 5-year projection consolidated, looking at the total operation. Connect Illinois was a this last round, they extended it. I think we had to do a 10-year with payback period calculated, what the return on that project would be with grant funding or with grant funding. And it was a standalone. So yes, it depends on the program, but I have only seen one funding program, and actually it was the state of South Dakota. We had our state grant program where the application was fairly simple. They did not require a feasibility study, but they did require a detailed CapEx budget, knowing that you're applying for grant funding and you've done your work on what it's going to take to build.
Good, thank you.
Mhm.
What about requests for proposals? And we actually have some of those in our toolkit that we can share about an RFP for as you seek a vendor. And we also have a list of vendors that we have that list of about a dozen different consultants to be able to seek proposals from. We all know that at this point there's pretty busy folks. And so again, competition for fiber, competition for engineering is both happening at the national level. So Christy and Kevin, thank you so much for a presentation today. It was as always great and solid information, and I think through the Accelerate program, you know, ideally we'd like to think that there's at the end of 14 weeks you say, oh well, here's our provider partner and here's the money we're going to go seek, and have it all queued up, and hopefully that's the case. But if not, then a community here may decide we need to invest in a little more engineering consideration to see what this will really cost, and move into that more formal feasibility study. So stay tuned for that. We've got a worksheet that you can use today to think about the feasibility study and how appropriate it is for your county, and begin just to have that conversation in your communities about whether that's something you're going to need to do. And again, what's the geography and some of those things that Christy started with in her first slide about the next steps on that. Kevin, Christy, any final words of wisdom for our folks?
I don't know necessarily words of wisdom for me, but I will share this. Thank you again, Bill, Adrian, Nancy, and team for the opportunity for us to present. I enjoyed the opportunity to talk about it. We do a tremendous amount of work in Illinois, and also I would offer this: if you know the chat box in this session isn't necessarily conducive to a conversation, but if anybody wants to have a conversation offline, I welcome the call anytime. I'm usually traveling, so any calls from 6 a.m. to midnight are usually answered. But if you want to get a hold of myself or Christy and just like, hey, what do you really mean about this? Or, you know, some question, if you're driving home in the evening, don't hesitate to call us, and we'd be glad to help you out along the way. Whether that's just answer the one question or diving into a full-blown feasibility study, we'd be glad to help.
Good. And Robbie, hopefully you're out there and queuing up that worksheet so folks can download that and use that to guide their discussions. There it is. Good. So as always, right on schedule. So thank you, everyone. And we're going to break into our rooms. But before we do, does anything new and good from our community reports that people want to talk about progress on their surveys or provider interviews and so on? Let's do a quick go around. Ogle? And Ogle and Friends, as I like to call it now. Ogle might be muted.
This is Dwayne Kelble from Putnam County. That's part of the Ogle group. We have sent out all the surveys, and we did it kind of last week, just before the holiday. And it looks by the report that, and we put it out to the radio stations, the public library system, schools and things like that. And it looks like just in a few days, we've got already 26 responses back. So That seems to be on course. Hopefully we'll get a lot more, but I think that's pretty good so far. I know the public library system is making sure that everybody comes in, gets a sheet, and is asked to do that. So,
oh, good.
So-
Mike Delaney says you have 280.
well, yesterday when I looked, it was 26. So Putnam
That's
County
good.
alone's
So-
got 280.
We like that growth curve.
Oh, the Ogle team altogether is 280. I was
Okay.
just speaking of Putnam County itself.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. How about Kaskaskia?
We have 530 responses so far.
Good. Anything else going on with provider interviews or?
Not at this time, but we are happy with the responses that were given back from the survey from the various counties because we're, multi-county group.
Mm-hmm. Good, good.
There are other people on the call from KC. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in, Nick or anyone, but I think that's our update for the moment.
Good. Kankakee Pembroke?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Our community partners were able to get the information out to the groups, kind of trying a couple different avenues. We've got business communities been involved. So trying to really get to households and businesses to see what the need is there. So Farm Bureau put it out in their monthly newsletter, went out through our business organization. And then there was a local event held in Pembroke Township where they were able to get quite a bit of information. So it looks like it's going really well.
Good, thank you. And Livingston.
Hi, Bill. Mike here. I'll represent the group today. So we're a little late to the punch, but we've got our surveys out. We've got the marketing kind of thrown out there. Postcards are headed out. We found that we hit it after the political postcard event. So maybe getting some data there. One thing that our group is kind of tripping up on is we're relying on the speed test, the UCLA speed test data. And some of the responses back from the survey takers is that they inadvertently click on the ads. It would be helpful if the state is looking for all of this data to trend together, if they would provide like some kind of a unified like speed test server that we could all kind of direct all of our surveys to. That could be helpful. But anyway, we're moving forward.
There actually is, it actually just goes to UCLA at the Illinois Broadband Office, there is a link, it goes to UCLA. So you end up on the same server. So, but I'll let our team will talk about that. Thanks for that feedback. Bond?
We've had a little bit of a head start here. We're at about 750 homes responding.
Good. And anything new with providers?
We have already done some early interviews with them. We will go back and reach out with them a little bit later, but we've had some good interviews recently.
Good, thank you. And Peoria Woodford.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Our survey responses continue to be really strong. We're approaching 1,000 in Peoria County, and our close date is tentatively set for July 16th. So we'll be putting the final push out this week for the survey. Woodford would like to keep their survey open a little bit longer. We want to continue to do some outreach. We're at 460 responses in Woodford County. We met yesterday and made some preliminary plans on how we will engage conversations with local governments based on the survey response, and then also talking a little bit about building those relationships with the local providers. So strategies for maybe some face-to-face panel discussions, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Good, sounds great. And one of the things with the surveys, you can keep them open, even beyond our study period here, our program period, but it'd be good to have some solid numbers in so that in weeks 12 and 13, when we're doing our final community plans, that you have that survey data. And if you can think about that and back up at least a week so that Nancy can and her team can clean the data and make sure it's accurate and try and find any issues with it in advance of those planning sessions. That's kind of the timing we're looking at. Good. Well, let's go into our rooms and just do your work. Take a look at this worksheet and think about whether this is something that you need for your county, your community, and how that might be done, or when and where, and then tackle your surveys, tackle your tasks around provider interviews, and so on. So good. Any last questions or comments from the communities? Kevin and Christy, I'm not sure if you're still on, but thank you so much. Again, it's really appreciated.
Thank you.
Thanks, team. See you, friends.
Bye.
Before I open up the breakout rooms, I just want to say that I've fired off those coverage maps to the respective teams for Kaskaskia College and Kankakee County, and you'll see those in your email. And I'll be visiting each of your breakout rooms to meet with you for just a small portion of the work session, just to have a discussion about just the snapshot of your coverage as of right now, and what you may want to do to cover some of those quiet spots. So expect me to visit. And with that, I'm going to open up the breakout rooms.
Thank you all. And thanks, Shabika, for your response on the on the speed test.